The evangelical Anabaptists were a group of 16th century reformers who had positioned themselves in such a way as to reestablish the pre-Constantinian church going back to the early church's history. Their simple, straightforward reading of the Bible, especially of the New Testament, eventually led them to embrace worship patterns that stood at odds with both the Roman Catholic Church and the emerging state churches Protestant tradition. Following the pattern that they saw clearly laid out in places like the book of Acts, they began to institute and found a believers' church with a believer's baptism as the entry point, the gateway into that church. And so, the changes that this group wanted to enact were decidedly out of step with the era. And the more that they pushed for changes, the more that they got pushed back from the governing authorities and even from some of the very famous Protestant reformers. In fact, a disputation in January of 1525 pitted these evangelical Anabaptists against their friend, their former mentor, Ulrich Zwingli. And so on January 21st, 1525, several of these prominent figures actually went about establishing the very first believers' church, a regenerate church body with a believer's baptism as its entry point. This had not been undertaken for over 1,000 years. They were forced to worship in some unique places. For instance, just outside of the city of Zurich, there remains even to this day an Anabaptist cave where these evangelical Anabaptists were forced from the cathedrals and large church buildings in the city center itself to these rural areas in hiding, isolated, and yet willing to endure hardships like worshiping in a cave to follow the prescriptions and the pattern set forth in Scripture. And they suffered greatly for their beliefs. For instance, Michael Sattler, the principal author of the Schleitheim Confession of Faith, died in 1527. One of the things that's so astonishing about him is the charges that were levied against him as a part of his trial. One, that he has taught and held and believed that the body and blood of Christ are not present in the sacrament. Teaching and believing that infant baptism does not conduce to salvation. He even left his monastic order and took a wife. Things that Protestants oftentimes, especially in a Baptist tradition, take for granted and recognize as normative. And yet he suffered because of these beliefs. Other men were simply run through with swords, or the wives of these Anabaptists were oftentimes drowned, pejoratively given what the authorities would call their second baptism. This group gives us much to think about when it comes not only to what we believe and why we hold to those beliefs, but more importantly, what are we willing to give up, sacrifice, or endure because of those beliefs?